Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. Today, we will be discussing U.S. versus Canadian SDS requirements, what you should know before sending your US SDSs to Canada. We'll be talking about the differences in a couple of the main sections of an SDS that are mandatory and some of the information that is just simply missing from the SDS that a Canadian company will need to know. Our presenters today are myself, Kirsten Alcock, and Ivy Tang. I've been working for Dell Tech Laboratories for almost 21 years now, with my main focus over this time being the authoring of safety data sheets through various regulatory changes over the last 20 years or so, consumer label requirements for the US and Canada, as well as transportation inquiries.
Hi everyone, I'm Ivy and I've been with Dell Tech for 5 years now, also in the product safety department. I work with the GHS workplace regulations, consumer chemical regulations, and vaping regulations as well. I also author SDSs and do consumer label reviews for US and Canadian consumer products.
In this slide, we have some of the services that Dell Tech currently offers. We have three main departments here at Dell Tech. We have the Product Safety Department, Regulatory Affairs, and Lab Services. We are your one-stop shop for everything regulatory. Our presentation today will be a brief overview of what we're looking for when our clients ask if they can use their US SDSs in Canada or ask us if they can just simply translate it into Canadian French. We have a disclaimer here basically indicating that the information we're providing today is not legal advice. If you're uncertain of the interpretation of OSHA and WHMIS regulations, we would suggest that you contact them directly. It can sometimes be rare to get things in writing, but we do suggest that when applicable. Some agencies are better than others when it comes to getting things in writing, but they're great to refer to later when that question might come up again. If you're concerned about confidentiality, we can contact the regulators for you on your behalf. And we do this for many of our clients who are not comfortable going to them directly. I've provided what we have as the current information available for both Health Canada and OSHA, please feel free to contact them directly if there's any information that you want to touch base with them on directly. So let's jump into our presentation today. On this slide, I have a brief outline of what our presentation will be touching on. We'll be looking at what an SDS is, what the GHS is, and to answer the question that we're here today for is, can I use my SDS? And what is unique to Canada? And we'll just go into a couple of the main sections that discuss this. So right now, I'm going to turn over the presentation to my colleague Ivy to start us off.
Thanks, Kirsten. So let's quickly discuss what the purpose of an SDS is. An SDS, or a safety data sheet, is essentially a document that discloses hazardous information about a chemical product. The information relates to the health and physical effects. For example, is the product corrosive? Is it flammable? Is it toxic, etc.? The chemical composition of the product, first aid measures, how the product should be stored and handled, exposure values of the hazardous chemicals in your product, basically information that is vital to occupational health and safety. SDSs have to be updated every so often, and how often that is dependent on the regulations, which may vary at the federal or state/provincial levels in order to ensure that the data is up to date and accurate. Now, an SDS is intended to be used in the workplace, for example, a manufacturing floor in a production facility, so employees can have access to the information to protect them from harm. But SDSs have kind of become a catch-all document that even retailers like Amazon or Walmart or Canadian Tire will ask for from their vendors. Please note that when chemical products are sold at a retail location, they are considered consumer products, not workplace products, and are technically exempt from needing an SDS. Nevertheless, retailers will more than often request an SDS anyways, and even refuse to stock your product without one. In order to accurately disclose hazardous health and physical information about a chemical product, we have to classify it using an international standard known as GHS, or Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. This way, all countries are on the same page when it comes to classification and labeling. GHS is managed by the United Nations, and they are in charge of publishing new revisions. So to your right, you'll have an image of the UN GHS Purple Book, which outlines all the available hazard categories, how to classify within each category, which symbols and statements to use, and references to test methods. You can find different revisions of the Purple Book online. Now, every country can choose which parts of GHS they want to adopt and implement. For example, under the skin corrosion and skin irritation classification, the UN may suggest 3 categories: Skin 1, Skin 2, and Skin 3. However, country A may choose to only adopt categories 1 and 2, while country B may choose to adopt all 3. Not only that, but different countries may be using different GHS revisions based on when they decide to adopt it. So as a result, you can't use one SDS worldwide. Despite us drawing from the same standard, each country's regulations are different, resulting in a different SDS. So the US adopted GHS in 2012, also known as HAZCOM 2012, or short for Hazardous Communication, and they are currently using revision 3 of GHS. Canada, however, adopted GHS in 2015, and it's called WHMIS 2015, WHMIS standing for Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, which can be used interchangeably with the term Hazardous Products Regulation, or HPR, and Canada is currently using revision 5. So this is the question that we get so often: can I use my US SDS in Canada? And the answer is, it really depends. Canada has a different set of requirements as to what must appear on the document, and as a result, you must make sure your SDS contains that information in order for it to be compliant and used appropriately in Canada. Now, we will get into the details specific to a Canadian SDS. An SDS typically has 16 sections, and we're only going to go through the ones that are relevant to the differences between a US and a Canadian document.
Okay, so what is unique to a Canadian SDS? Our SDS template in Canada follows what we call Schedule 1 of the Hazardous Products Regulations, which most people just short to HPR. I provided here the current website link that you can go to. One thing to note is Health Canada has been down over the last couple of days, so hang tight. They're working on it if it's not already up and working right now. What we have is Schedule 1 goes into great detail about what they call the information elements on a safety data sheet. So the schedule itself provides information on all the required headings that must be on your safety data sheet, along with the specific information elements. One thing you want to do is you want to make sure and check with your SDS authoring program that you purchased to ensure that these headings and subheadings are being met. They must be there, and you must use the terminology that's used in Schedule 1 in English and in French. There's a French link at the top of each website provided by Health Canada, so you'll find all of your translations there. As many of you know, there are a variety of ways to translate words. So the Canadian government has taken the guessing game away from us and provided the translated words for us for each individual section, which is fantastic. So check with your software supplier to ensure that the proper government-approved statements are being used for your safety data sheets. Within your SDS, if the information is not available, then simply place not available on your document or not applicable. You may not leave it blank. This is a mistake that we see on many safety data sheets when companies leave the section blank. Each specific element needs to be present and have a statement associated with it. So let's jump into Section 1, Identification. So Section 1 of the Safety Data Sheet in Canada has 5 specific information elements, which I've placed below. Product identifier, other means of identification, recommended use and restrictions on use, initial supplier identifier, and emergency telephone, and any restrictions on the use of that number. One of the things that Health Canada requests is that the Canadian address for your company or the address of the distributor in Canada is present. We understand that this is a point of contention with many of our clients, as some companies do not have this information or do not want to provide their distributor address. It is, however, a requirement, and you may wish to speak to Health Canada about this. We at Dell Tech cannot provide you an exemption on this. So if you have an issue with this particular requirement, you will need to speak to Health Canada on this. We can help you understand the regulations, but we are not the regulators for Canada and cannot provide an exemption for you. An emergency telephone number is required on Canadian SDSs. Please ensure that this number can be used from Canada. I've come across many numbers on SDSs in the past where the number cannot be reached. So please ensure that you have someone testing this out. If that emergency number is the main desk and their office hours are 9 to 5, you'll want to place this on the SDS. So the individual who's using the document will know what time someone is available to help them. Section 2, otherwise known as hazard identification. So Section 2 of the SDS is where you will find the GHS classification for your product, the appropriate signal word, hazard statement, prevention, response, storage, and disposal statements. One thing to note here is that Canada has some unique classifications that would not be listed on a US SDS. These are HHNOC and PHNOC. Some of you might be wondering what these are. So HHNOC refers to health hazards not otherwise classified Category 1, and PHNOC refers to physical hazards not otherwise classified Category 1. The U.S. merged these into one classification, HNOC, whereas Canada further classified them into health and physical hazards. So if you have a product that meets either of these categories, these need to be spelled out in this section 2, and it needs to be spelled out in which one it refers to, the health or the physical. Another thing to note, what GHS statements are you using? So when the Canadian regulations refer to the GHS, what they're referring to is GHS version 5. I've added the snippets below just so you can see this coming out of our regulations. This can be found in Part 1 of the Hazardous Products Regulations. So I've chosen to pick one of my favorite classifications where I know there's a difference between the two countries. This slide shows you the difference between the statements from version 3, which the US is using, to version 5, which we're on in Canada, for the classification of corrosive to metals. Although the classification criteria are the same between the two countries, the statement requirements are different. The Category 1, signal word, hazard statement, and symbol are the same, but as you can see here in my example, the prevention, response, and storage statements are different. So if you are sending a product to Canada and your classification is corrosive to metals, please ensure that you're using the correct version to bring your product into Canada and use version 5 statements. There are many other classifications that have the same issue. So you'll need to have a copy of the GHS version 3 and 5 to determine what the differences are between the two countries. One thing to note is that the U.S. Department of Labor issued an OSHA instruction document, which was effective on July 9th of 2015. In this document, on page 5 to 6, the guidance indicates that the US HCS 2012 is based on GHS revision 3. However, in the U.S., you are permitted to use more recent revisions as long as the information doesn't contradict or cast doubt on OSHA required information. For more information on this, I have provided the link in the document so you can download it for your files. This document goes into further details on what is required. Please note that we're not here to discuss this document in detail, as today's webinar is to highlight what is required for your SDS to be used in Canada. If you have any further questions on this particular document, you will need to contact your representative at OSHA. Composition 3. What I find here is that the most mistakes on US SDSs coming to Canada are within this section. So Canada is very specific on the requirements for Section 3. We need to see the chemical name, CAS number, and concentration. Canada recently changed the regulations to allow us to use weight ranges again. When the regulations first came in, we were not permitted to use those trade secret ranges, but industry fought to get that back. So what you can see here are the ranges that were chosen by Health Canada. They are similar to those that were permitted under the old Controlled Products Regulations, or CPR, but there now are more options under the Hazardous Products Regulations. For example, in the past, we could use the range 60 to 100, which is something I still continue to see on many SDSs coming to Canada. Basically, it's legacy, but that is no longer an option in Canada. So what you must do is choose the most appropriate range. So for 60 to 100, you've got 45 to 70, 60 to 80, 65 to 85, and 80 to 100 as your options. So make sure that you're choosing the appropriate one and no longer using 60 to 100 as your trade secret range. So as I just discussed, in order to use these ranges, we must claim them as trade secret. A very large difference between Canada and the US is the claim trade secret. When I refer to the words trade secret, and here I'm referring to the ranges. And when you refer to the ranges, it does not require paperwork to Health Canada to make a claim. But, and I have a big but here, if you want to claim trade secret for your CAS number or the chemical name, in Canada you are required by law to send in paperwork to make an HMIRA claim for exemption. This is not free. There are fees involved for claiming trade secret in Canada, and so when you submit your claim, you will have a fee associated with that. If this is something that you're not comfortable doing, please contact us and we can help you with this process. Just out of curiosity, I thought you might be wondering what those fees might be. So here's the currently listed fee structure on the website for Health Canada. Please note that it will be changing soon. So if it's something you're interested in, you'll want to get the claim in as soon as possible. Another thing to know, these are Canadian dollars and not US dollars, so you can get a little bit of a discount in there as well. I'm now going to pass the presentation over to my colleague Ivy to discuss a couple of other sections where we see the most mistakes on documents coming across the border.
The next section where the differences between US and Canadian SDSs is very pronounced is Section 8, Exposure Controls. Each province or territory in Canada has their own occupational exposure limits, or OELs. Likewise, OELs will differ depending on which U.S. state the product is sold or manufactured in. The OEL is the acceptable upper limit of a concentration of a hazardous material in the air of a workplace. For example, if your product contains methanol, you must know the OEL because above the limit, it would be a toxicity hazard to the workers that could potentially be exposed to it. OELs are typically established by the province's Ministry of Labor, so you have to know which province your product will be sold in order to know which OELs to disclose in Section 8 of your document. The next section that is applicable to our conversation today is Section 14, Transportation. Note that this section is actually not mandatory on an SDS, but we strongly advise that if you have it on your document, you have it completed correctly. Again, because the SDS has become a catch-all document for all applicable information, including transport. Note that Section 14 does not replace your bill of lading or other important shipping documents. You must always have those on hand, but it's important that the information on your bill of lading does match what is written in Section 14. Canada follows the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Regulations, or TDG, and the U.S. follows 49 CFR. There are distinctions here, especially between the UN numbers and the shipping names used. For example, the U.S. has NA numbers, or North American numbers, like NA 1993, combustible liquid, that's not applicable to Canada. The label placards for Canada can also be different from the U.S. Here below, you'll see 2 links to the TDG regulations about label placarding and how they're different from the U.S. Here's an example of a Class 3 flammable liquid. As you can see, the U.S. label on the bottom and placard contain the words flammable liquid written across the safety mark, whereas Canada, up above, does not. It's a small but important distinction to make. A product from the U.S. can come into the first port in Canada using the reciprocity rule, but once the product is in Canada, you must use the correct and compliant label and placarding within our Canadian borders. This also means that if you display the safety mark in Section 14 of the SDS, you have to make sure that it's changed once you are using the product in Canada. Here's a quick snapshot of the table of contents from the Canadian TDG regulations, which discusses the section in which you can find more information about the reciprocity rule.
Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through the next slides here. Section 15 is the regulatory information on a safety data sheet. Also, a section that is not technically mandated, but is a section which you should include information for your product as a whole coming to Canada. This is a section where you'll find information on our inventory list. So in the US, you have your TSCA inventory list, whereas in Canada, we have what we refer to as the DSL and the NDSL. This is something that you must know before you import your product. So please check with your chemists when you're in the formulation stage to confirm this. If you are trying to bring in something that is not listed, there are requirements for notification. Again, this is something that we can help you with at Dell Tech. We can help advise what the trigger levels are and what the requirements are for the paperwork. If you need more information on this, we have employees on staff to help. So please send us a separate email after the presentation and we can help you determine your inventory status for Canada. I've provided the current list here where you can find out if your chemical is listed on the DSL or the NDSL. And lastly, let's discuss how old is that SDS that you're using. Federally in Canada, the requirement to update your SDS every 3 years was abolished when we adopted the HPR, but that doesn't mean you don't need to update your safety data sheet. There are some provinces that actually do require updated SDSs every 3 years. When I last looked into this, the following provinces still required updates: Saskatchewan, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and BC. There may actually be more now. You need to know and determine which provinces you're selling into if you plan on bringing in an SDS that is not within 3 years. If information changes on the ingredients within your product, you must also update your safety data sheet. If there's significant new data on your product or the ingredients within your product have changed, you must update your SDS. So this is why at Dell Tech, we still insist on doing a 3-year review with you, just so you'll know if there's any new information on any of the individual chemicals that can impact your classification as a whole. There could be new occupational exposure limits that you need to comply with, and you will not know that unless you update your safety data sheet, as well as other things like IARC impact your classification. So if a new chemical has been listed on that, you will need the new classification that comes along with that. So that's why we really do insist that you keep an eye on your formulations and keep up to date on what you're selling to your clients. So this leads us to our question period. What we'll do is we'll read over the questions received and see if we can provide some further guidance to you. If you have something specific to your company, we encourage you to contact us directly and we can see how we can help. So our question here is, if there is no significant new data, do you still need to update the version and revision date of an SDS after 3 years? Yes. So if there is no significant new data, but you are trying to sell to one of those provinces that has mandated that you still have the 3 years, then yes, you should update the version and the revision date on the SDS to show to your users that you are looking at the information and you've proved that you have looked at it after 3 years. So you'll be in compliance for those particular provinces. Thank you for that question. Another question we have here is, how does one reconcile differing statements from Canada and the US in the GHS panel? So as we said, OSHA provided a document saying that you can use later versions of the GHS. So what we have done, and we had actually sent a document to OSHA with respect to when there appears to be different language. So what we do here at Dell Tech is we use the version 5 statements. Canada cannot use version 3 statements. That is our requirement. But the US did have that guidance that said they could use later versions. So that is currently what we do at Dell Tech when there are slightly different statement requirements between the two. So we have a question on which provinces have the 3-year renewal. So when I last looked into it, I had provided those on the document, but it was, we've got Saskatchewan, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and BC. That doesn't mean that some of the other provinces haven't currently adopted that. You would need to look into each ministry to determine in each of the provinces if they've changed their regulations as well. So basically, if you want to sell to Canada and not have any restrictions or worry about where your SDS is going, we suggest having the 3 years, do a 3-year review on your safety data sheet just to ensure that everything's up to date before sending it here, because there can be changes within those provinces. So you would have to contact each ministry. So that can be a very time-consuming process.
There's also, just jump in here, some provinces that unfortunately I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are some provinces that have come out and explicitly said, no, we do not require this 3-year renewal period, but there are also a handful of other provinces that haven't explicitly said yes or no. So we try to keep up to date and we check regularly. If you want a list along with links to the provincial regulations, send us an email and we'll send you that document so you have easy access to that information.
Yeah. I think it was last year I actually wrote a blog on this. So if you follow us on our Dell Tech LinkedIn, we always put blogs up on our, basically probably at least I'd say 1 a week or 2 a week with information such as this. So it's great if you follow us because I did last year put information regarding the 3-year new renewal. So if you go to my LinkedIn information, you can find me there and have all of the articles that I've written over the past couple of years, which refer to safety data sheets, their requirements, the particular provinces that I just discussed now, and all of that information is in the different articles that I've written. We would like to thank you for attending this webinar today. One thing I want you to note is that we moved in the past year. So if you have us in your system under our old address, please have that updated to our new area that we're at. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and goodbye from Dell Tech.